what she calls homo faber and animal laborans to the Nazi gas chambers, where she introduces the superfluous, the outlaws, those who are not taken in by the law, are not allowed by the law. The stateless person. These, of course, became for and we'll see, for someone like Judith Butler, the ungrievable. She's the first one, really, no, I wouldn't say the first, but the first one to really solidly create that entity as symbolic, way back in the 1940s, of the world that Said talks about in 1993, when he says, we're all refugees now. The world that we live in is a world of refugees, of emigres. This is why Arendt is so important a figure in this thing. That's why I had a hard time keeping her out of the reading list. And why I changed my mind and put it back and why her representation of herself as a conscious pariah, as an exilic figure, outside, inside, and her articulation of that over and over and over again in her work. Renders her and that thematics of the refugee, the idea of the refugee, so crucial. Her representation of modernity is very dark. But it is precisely in its darkness a reference to the expulsion of human beings from humanity at such. Remember that last passage that I quoted. Not the loss of specific rights then, but the loss of a community willing and able to guarantee any rights whatsoever has been the calamity which has befallen ever increasing numbers of people. Man, it turns out, can lose all so-called rights of man without losing his essential quality as man, his human dignity. Only the loss of a polity itself expels him from humanity, in her. Its expulsion from humanity, its utter denial of language to the vast population of exilic, superfluous, her word, precipitated by the fulfillment of the logic of belonging of the nation state. Two, the positive possibilities of this enforced, exilic, dehumanized condition. Despite the darkness, in the very darkness, there is the potentiality of a new kind of light. It's only tentative for her, but it's there. And it comes from that motif that I've been talking about, or I've used to talk about what's happening, what has been happening historically in modernity, vis-a-vis the logic of modernity, or more specifically, the logic of the nation state, the fulfillment of the logical of the nation state at that liminal point, the most dark point, is where the light, the potentiality of light emerges. That's what we are, and I've said it before many times, that's what we are now in our historical conjuncture. That liminal point where the logic fulfills it. Again, this notion this notion of the liminal point, which is both dark and revelatory at the same time, goes back to Heidegger, who called the end of the Western tradition the end of philosophy, by which he meant the fulfillment of its logic and its demise and its self-destruction for a different kind of thinking. At that liminal point, which points to an alternative language to the plenary, vocational, and interpolative language, the language of the calling of the nation state, a spectral, subversive language, that of the conscious pariah, which, like Said's Adornian version, which we referred to last time, in refusing to be answerable to the hierarchy's call, can call the hierarchy by its right name, oppressive right name, end quote. More specifically, in calling into question the means-ends language of the nation state under the sway of Homo Faber, this alternative language, precipitated by the fulfillment of the logic of the nation state, Hannah Arendt implies, no doubt with his fellow Jewish exile, Walter Benjamin, in mind, has its point of departure in the radically transient, i.e. profane time of the now, the exilic in-between time of the interregnum, that, it will be recalled, Said was deposited as the locus of the new post-colonial form of resistance. Liberation, as an intellectual mission, you recall, has now shifted from the settled, established, and domesticated dynamics of culture to its unhoused, decentered, and exilic energies whose incarnation today is the migrant and whose incarnation is that of the intellectual and artist in exile, the political figure between domain, between form, between homes, and between languages. Again, that in between. The liberatory potential of the conscious pariah, disclosed by the coming to its end of the logic of belonging of the nation state, is implied throughout The Origins of Totalitarianism, her great book, in 3 volumes, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Particularly in the second volume, Imperialism, which, in the case of Said's, as in the case of Said's diagnosis of the post-colonial moment of cultural imperialism, focuses on the reduced status of the vast population of stateless people precipitated by the contradictory combination of imperialism, the precipitation of racism, and the administration of human bodies as means of domesticating their threat, and the binary logic of belonging of the nation-state in the wake of World War II. But for a reason that will become clear shortly, I will cite Arendt's earlier proleptic biographical essay, We Refugees. A very important essay that has been unaddressed by and large by virtually everybody who talked about Hannah Arendt and about the context that we're talking about in this class. We Refugees. It's a relatively short essay, but tremendously powerful in what she has to say. So much so that it becomes, and this is why I'm focusing on this particular essay, We Refugees. So much so, so powerful, that it attracted Agamben's attention and became the point of departure of Agamben's whole meditation on the potentiality of the refugee, which we'll talk about later on. I'm just going to quote one passage from that. In that essay, she distinguishes between the parvenu and the conscious pariah. And in so doing, identifies the refugee not only as the defining figure of the post-war global occasion, but also as the, in her words, vanguard of their people. The vanguard of their people. Quote, history, I'll go slow. History has forced the status of outlaws upon us. That is to say, the World War II, and particularly the Holocaust. The slaughter of a vast population of humanity. History has forced the status of outlaws upon both, upon conscious pariahs and parvenus alike. The latter have not yet, the parvenus, have not yet accepted the great wisdom of Balzac's on ne parvient pas deux fois. One does not arrive, one does not succeed twice. Thus, they, the parvenus, those who have been made superfluous, outlawed, but who don't know it, who accept that condition, as opposed to the conscious pariah, the exilic conscious, who does. The latter have not accepted the great wisdom of Balzac. One does not arrive, succeed twice. Thus, they don't understand that the wild dreams of the former, the conscious pariah, and she has in mind people like Heinrich Heine, her favorite figure, what's his name, Jewish figure of the period of the Dreyfus affair in mid-19th century France, a Jewish conscious pariah, the name I forget among others. Do not understand the wild dreams of the former, the conscious pariah, and feel humiliated in sharing their defeat. These few refugees who insist upon telling the truth, even to the point of indecency, get in exchange for their unpopularity one precise advantage. History, and she underlines it, history, all of history, Western history, is no longer a closed book to them, to the conscious pariah, and politics no longer the privilege of Gentiles, of Westerners. They know that the outlawing of the Jewish people in Europe, the outlawing of the Jewish people of Europe, had been followed closely by the outlawing of most European nations. This is not, Hannah Arendt is not singling out the Jewish situation. She's saying that the Jewish is one major outlawing. But she's also saying that this has happened to many large sums of other human beings who are not Jews. And in this sense, the Jew and the non-Jew become related in her consciousness, as it should be, of course. History is no longer a closed book to them, and politics no longer the privilege of Gentiles, which, determines who ought to be allowed to be political and who ought not to be political. They know that the outlawing of the Jewish people in Europe has been followed closely by the outlawing of most European nations. Refugees driven from country to country represents the vanguard of their people. If, there's a dash and it says, if they keep their identity. That's that paradox we talked about. Becoming a non-Jewish Jew. We'll see how Agamben opens out this following Said, not following Said, but echoing Said and following Hannah Arendt. Agamben will open up this and make his opening up a fundamental to his whole orientation toward both resistance and the coming community. We'll see that shortly. Again, let me read that. Refugees driven from country to country represent the very great paradox that these people who have been made superfluous become the vanguards. How do you get from that status to becoming the vanguard of the people? But that's precisely the point that she drives home by the force of that paradox, that contradiction. And again, of course, we can explain it by the analysis that I have labored to get into your heads, the notion of the liminal point of the logic of Western civilization, particularly the nation-state logic. In this passage, if they keep their identity, that is to say, refuse to be assimilated, as the vast majority of Jews were assimilated to their condition. For the first time, Jewish history is not separated but tied up with that of all other nations. The comity of European peoples went to pieces when and because it allowed the weakest member to be excluded and persecuted. Again, vision of the re-relating the Jews with the rest of humanity. In this passage, Arendt, it is important to register, not simply envisions the exilic refugee, understood as conscious pariah, or in Said's formulation following Isaac Deutscher, as non-Jewish Jew, the nobody who becomes conscious of his superfluity, is enabled, like Bartleby, to use its in-betweenness, its identity-less identity, non-Jewish Jew, against the oppressor as the paradoxical figure that promises liberation. From the exilic vantage point of the time of the now, the refugee as conscious pariah in the interregnum, she also, like Said, however indirectly, envisions a coming polis that, in its refusal of the Trinity intrinsic to the structure of the nation state, the Trinity, I think I referred to this last time, state, nation, nativity, and territory, that space where it is assumed, but contradictorily, of course, where everyone comes from the same birth, the nation. In its refusal of the Trinity intrinsic to the structure of the nation state, nation, nativity, territory, or, more accurately, in rendering that metaphysical structure inoperative, is proleptic of the radical, different, decentered, structureless structure of the polis being envisioned by post-post-structuralists like Agamben, Badiou, Zizek, Rancière, Butler, and others. It's very tentative in Hannah Arendt, very tentative. But she puts in place an analysis of the superfluous person, the outlawed person, the stateless person, puts into place a context for people, and particularly Agamben, to think positively in terms of the coming community, the coming polis. And not least is, of course, the nexus of speech/act, the speech/act, what she conceived of, the polity, a true polity. Okay, so now we can go to Agamben, though I want to remind you that the figure we've already talked about should be kept in mind. As we discuss Agamben, and that, of course, is Michel Foucault, and Foucault's genealogy of the disciplinary society, and particularly that biopoliticization of man that produces the disciplinary society. This is, the combination of Hannah Arendt focus on the outlawed person, the superfluous person, and Agamben's and Foucault's analysis of the disciplinary society, the biopoliticization of modern humanity, that leads him into to his analysis of Lusaka. Agamben more than any other of the others in this constellation that we've established, we've been trying to establish in this class from the post-structuralist to the post-structuralist, epitomizes the legacy that begins with Heidegger and culminates with the post-structuralist. To me, at any rate, he epitomizes it most clearly because he makes reference to his roots, constantly makes reference to his roots, particularly Heidegger and Arendt and Foucault, constantly acknowledges his debt to these precursors, these post-structuralist precursors. Whereas Zizek and Rancière, even Judith Butler, don't, at least not to the degree that he does. Like Hannah Arendt, he was a student of Heidegger, both in the literal and metaphorical sense. He, as a young man, he went on 2 occasions to southern France, where Heidegger would come to teach with his in behalf of his friend, the great I'm blocking French poet. Can anyone help me? No, probably not. Who would invite Heidegger during the summer to seminars on his work, and this poet, French poet, was enormously influenced by Heidegger's work. Can't remember his name. I'll remember it later on. And Agamben, an Italian young man, came on 2 occasions over a long period of time, and heard Heidegger firsthand. And so, in many ways, you can see that the analogy I want to establish between Hannah Arendt, who was a student of Heidegger, literal and metaphorically, and Agamben, who was a student literally and metaphorically of Heidegger. Like Heidegger's destruction, Agamben's destruction of the Western metaphysical thinking has as its fundamental critical purpose to demonstrate that metaphysics necessarily represents being as teleological, being with a capital letter, informed by a principle of presence that reduces the temporality of being to a linear, circular, beginning, middle, and end structure. We've seen this over and over again, but I'm re-emphasizing because this I'm interpreting Agamben now, who literally repeats this. To thematize the optical metaphor that informs thinking, metaphysica, his panoptic eye, views the being of being, which is to say, spatializes or structures a singular and unrepresentable dynamic, its nothingness, to render it, quote unquote, comprehensible, that is, subject of mastery, from the Latin prehendere, to grasp, you remember. In other words, like Heidegger's, Agamben's destruction of the Western metaphysical thinking is intended to reveal that Western metaphysical thinking in all its manifestations, Greco-Roman, Christian, and Enlightenment, is informed by the will to power over the phenomena represented by the second term of the teleological binary formula constituting the essence of metaphysical thinking. Identity, the second term, difference, identity, or the other technical term is presence, as opposed to temporal dynamic. Identity is the condition for the possibility of difference, radical temporality, the nothing, and not the other way around. That's Heidegger's version, that's Agamben's version. What is different from Heidegger in Agamben's initial critical gesture is his conscious affirmation of the indissoluble relationality, and this is important to emphasize in the context of what we've said a bit about the post-structure and the post-structure vis-a-vis the worldliness of their project. What is different from Heidegger in Agamben's initial critical gesture is his conscious affirmation of the indissoluble relationality of the ontological and the worldly sites of the continuum of being. Being and politics. And his sustained effort to think both the critical and positive implications of this affiliation between the being of being and politics. That's the difference. That's what makes him much more a resonant figure for us than Heidegger. According to Agamben, the Western teleological structuring interpretation of the being of being, particularly in its modern anthropological phase, assigns as an inscribed imperative the human species its mode of moral comportment towards being polyvalent sites. It precipitates a binary means-ends logic. We introduced this in Hannah Arendt, Homo Faber. It precipitates a binary means-ends logic vis-a-vis being in which the means, as in the case of time, the nothing, difference, the question in the metaphysical schema, is subordinated to the end. In Agamben's preferred formulation, this teleological structuring interpretation of being renders potentiality dependent on the act. We've said this over and over again, but now it's Agamben I'm interpreting. Agamben means end, both means without end. Following and radicalizing Heidegger's critical diagnosis of the calculative means-end logic of technological revealing, Gestalt, the enframement that challenges force, and particularly Hannah Arendt's critique of the means-end logic of Homo Faber, man the maker, the presiding figure of man in Enlightenment modernity, Agamben reads this teleologic as imposing a vocational ethics on humanity. That's his term. I borrow it from him. Well, I want to qualify. My understanding of the term vocation, the calling, is a modification of Agamben. I began to think about the idea of the calling of vocation by way of Agamben's reference, repeated reference to the notion of vocation, man's vocation. But I modified by way of my knowledge, which Agamben doesn't have, of the idea of vocation as that is fundamental to the development of the American national identity, the Puritan concept of the call, the Protestant version of the vocation. And I think those two, keeping those two in mind would be very helpful. But anyway, Agamben reads this teleologic as imposing a vocational, his term, vocational ethic on humanity. By vocation, he means not too distant from offices of interpolation we've seen now, or the Wall Street lawyer's calling of Bartleby in Melville's story. A hailing, hey you, a hailing from above that demands the postponement of existential encounter with transient temporality, the time of the now to anticipate, in favor of slavishly serving a higher cause, that in providing the human subject with the illusion of being the master of the phenomena of being, a subject is reduced to disposable reserve, as Heidegger puts it. A subjective subject, as Althusser puts it, a useful and docile body, as Foucault puts it. Quote from Agamben's Coming Community. The fact, the fact that must constitute the point of departure for any discourse on ethics. That's his topic, Agamben's topic, this particular ethics. That term has been a kind of constant in this class, although I haven't articulated it. But I'm going to postpone it until we get to Badiou, whose book I've asked you to read is called Ethics. And obviously it's a violent critique of ethics, as ethics has come down to us in the Western tradition, in favor of a different version, a different understanding of ethics. The fact, and Agamben here in this passage from the Coming Community is invoking this problematic, which has become fundamental in modernity or postmodernity, as a problem. This notion of ethical. The fact that must constitute the point of departure for any discourse on ethics is that there is no essence. There is no essence, no historical or spiritual vocation, no biological destiny that humans must enact or realize. This is the only reason why something like ethics can exist. An ethics can exist only when there is no higher cause. An ethics which is based on a higher cause is not an ethic, it's something that is determined by something outside us as human beings. Something supernatural, whether God or history with a capital letter, as we've been saying all along. The fact that must constitute the point of departure, the beginning of any discourse on ethics, is that there is no essence, no historical or spiritual vocation, no biological destiny that humans must enact to realize. This is the only reason why something like ethics can exist, because it is clear that if humans were or had to be this or that substance, had this or that identity once and for all, essentially, this or that destiny, no ethical experience would be possible. Ethics is a form of utter and absolute engagement, existential engagement. There would be, beautifully puts it, this or that destiny, no other experience would be, no ethical experience would be possible. There would only be tasks to be done. Only tasks to be done. Work to be done. This does not mean, however, he goes on, that human beings are not and do not have to be something, that they are simply consigned to nothingness and therefore can freely decide whether to be or not to be, to adopt or not to adopt this or that destiny, nihilism, a decision of coincidence. There is, in effect, something that humans are and have to be. But this something is not an essence, nor properly a thing. It is the simple fact of one's own existence as possibility or potentiality, independent of the act, which, when you include it, brings in with it the principle of identity. Humans have no identity. Then, you know, the idea, humankind, as if all of humanity can be characterized by one principle, one identical principle. Humanity for these guys, a multiple, plural in the absolute sense of that word. That doesn't mean that they're not human. They're human. They have a character, if you will. But paradoxically, what makes them human is their, to use terms we've been using in class, their existent insistence. Their existent insistence, which makes them plural. What constitutes humanity is conscious plurality. When you think of mankind as mankind, as something, informed by a principle of presence, a principle of identity, you automatically, you automatically bring in without even knowing it, servitude to that identity, to that higher quality. You bring in servitude, you bring in enslavement, ultimately. It is, I suggest, this vocational means ends logic, this calculative mode of knowledge production Heidegger called the framing the challenges for, or in Arendt's formulation, the socialization of modernity, of the private sphere, man's metabolization with nature, which is intrinsic to the wordlessness of the echoes of animal labyrinth that Agamben radicalizes in Homo Sacer. Heidegger, Arendt. Heidegger's critique of enframing, and Arendt's critique of Homo faber, insofar as the pursuit of the logic of Homo faber produces Homo laborans in the end. And Homo Sacer. That's the continuity I want to trace. I've been trying to trace. Taking his directives from Foucault's diagnosis of modern society as a disciplinary society that reduces human life to useful and docile bodies, or more precisely, a biopolitical society, in which biopolitics is practiced right down to the capillaries of the body politic. Agamben radicalizes Arendt's account of the reemergence in late modernity of the totally unworldly, and I'm using this language because she uses it, and because we know that it's fundamental to Said, and it is a language that has been used by certain progressive, radical, worldly critics to attack this whole momentum beginning with post-structuralism. So this term, worldly and unworldly, are crucial terms, and we must constantly keep them in mind if the purpose of this course is going to manifest itself fully. Agamben radicalizes Arendt's account of the reemergence in late modernity of the totally unworldly, her term, unpolitical animal laborans, by way, ironically, of the fulfillment of Homo faber's means and logic, his privileging of the act, Homo faber's privileging of the act over potentiality that produces what Arendt called the consumer society. He reads the dehumanizing consequence of the increasing biopoliticization of life in modernity, not simply as the reproduction of animal laborans, as such, i.e. Hannah Arendt's term, the metabolism with nature. She equates the idea of animal laborans with man's metabolism with nature, or as useful and docile bodies, but as animal laborans in its extremest form. He pushes Arendt, animal laborans, Foucault's useful and docile body to its extremest form, bare life, vida nuda, life that can be killed, as we've seen, without the act being called murder, and, of course, the concentration camp. That zone of indistinction between exclusion and inclusion in which bare life is caught as the paradigmatic liminal space of modernity, totalitarian and democracy, in which the dehumanizing logic of biopolitics becomes, as the qualification of bare life I just made makes clear, thanatopolitics. Biopolitics in its extremist form becomes thanatopolitics. Bare life that can be killed with impunity without its being called murder. Now, Agamben, and this was not, I think, emphasized enough in the reports on Agamben's bare life, and I want therefore to at least retrieve that omission and make it central to our understanding of Agamben's notion of bare life. Agamben's model, of course, in its extreme model, is the Nazi concentration camp and the way the Jews were treated there, the gas chamber. But Agamben makes it very, very explicit that the Nazi gas chamber is a liminal facet, the liminal moment, a precursive, proleptic, liminal example of the logic that produces bare life. That it now has penetrated into all of life in democratic society. In the discourse of the law, in the discourse of medicine, hospitals, in the discourse of education. It's there and it's taking roots in the capillaries of society. And the point that Heidegger is making is that we must absolutely break the hold that liberal democracy has had on us, which separates democracy from totalitarian society. That distinction, which defines the liberal democratic perspective, is insidious in that it conceals the absolute continuity between democracies as democracies have emerged in the Enlightenment period by way of capitalism and totalitarianism. There's a continuity there, and it is criminal on the part of liberals to put democracy in a superior binary opposition to totalitarianism. That's the important point. That's the important point these guys are making. Become counterpolitics. Let me read the passage from Agamben, Osaka. Along with the emergence of biopolitics, we can observe a displacement and gradual expansion beyond the limits of the decision on bare life, in which sovereignty consisted. If there is a line in every modern state marking the point at which the decision on life becomes a decision on death, and biopolitics can turn into thanatopolitics, this line no longer appears today as a stable border dividing two clear, distinct zones, i.e., concentration camp and the world outside. That line has been blurred. That line has been blurred. This line now in motion. It's in motion now. That's what I mean by it's been blurred. It's in motion. And gradually moving into areas other than that of political life. Areas in which the sovereign is entering into ever more intimate symbiosis, not only with the jurist, the law, but also with the doctor, the medical profession, and of course, let us remember, let us be aware, as most of us are, how massive the medical profession and all its offshoots, pharmacological, pharmacologist industry, and so on and so forth, on TV and so on and so forth, has penetrated the modern Western way of life, particularly in America. It's not a minor thing, although it's always it always seems to most Americans that something marginal, nothing. It's not marginal. It's fundamental, and it's producing what Agamben is doing a lot to produce what Agamben is suggesting here. Intimate symbiosis, not only with the jurist, but also with the doctor, the scientist, the expert, and the priest. All those that seem to be what's the word I want? Superstructural. All those elements of society would be superstructural. But they're not superstructural. They're fundamental. In the pages that follow, Agamben says, we shall try to show that certain events that are fundamental for the political history of modernity, such as the Declaration of Rights, as well as others that seem instead to represent an incomprehensible intrusion of biopolitical scientific principles into the political order, such as the national socialist eugenics and its elimination of life that is unworthy of being lived, or the contemporary debate on the normative determination of death criteria, as in, who in the sick realm of the sick ought to die and who ought not to. Acquire their true sense only if they are brought back to the common biopolitical or thanatopolitical context to which they belong. From this perspective, the camp as the pure, absolute, and impassable biopolitical space, insofar as it is founded solely on the state of exception, we'll talk about this later, will appear as the hidden paradigm of the political space of modernity, of modern liberal capitalist modernity. Remember that? The Nazis prematurely, proleptically pushed the logic of the nation state and all of its courtesans to the point where it now illuminates what has been the case all along. Will appear as a hidden paradigm of the political space of modernity, whose metamorphoses and disguises, masquerades, we will learn to recognize. And of course, he means hopefully, although we're not doing a good job of it. for sure. End quote. That, it seems to me, is a passage that you should burn into your heads. Or I wish you would, as students of this class. If Agamben's first major departure from Heidegger is his radicalization of the latter's disclosure of the vocational means and logic of modern technology eventually reduces the human species to disposable reserve, the second related departure from Heidegger is his related identification of the state of exception as the foundational principle of the accelerating momentum that is reducing human life to bare life and displacing the polis by the concentration camp as a hidden paradigm of the modern, quote, democratic age. Second, in modernity, according to Agamben, the state of exception, as in the case of Nazi Germany or the United States of the George Bush administration, has become the rule, become the norm. Under its aegis, the primary goal of political decision-making has become national security, the preservation of the national body politic. At this paradoxical liminal point in the process, in the pursuit of its logic of belonging, the law, the human right to be, has been obliterated in the name, by the paradoxical name of saving it. And the binary friend-foe logic, which, as Agamben, reading Carl Schmitt against himself, shows, is intrinsic to the exceptionalist sovereign logos of metaphysical thinking. That's another thing that I think worth pausing over. When I refer to exceptionalism, and when the term exceptionalism nowadays comes into play, we always think of it in terms of American exceptionalism. But one of the points that I've been, hopefully has come through in this class, one of the points that I've been making all along, that yes, America represents itself as an exceptional nation, and in the process of that representation, it has produced real history. But the ultimate fact is that America is not exceptional. That America is very old world, is the heir of the old world. Although you have to realize that the old world, Europe, founded its own identity, European Western identity, on the basis of an exceptionalist relationship to the rest of the world, to the Eastern world, to the Oriental world. So that exceptionalism is fundamental to the myth of exception, fundamental to Western civilization at large. And in this sense, yes, America is exceptional within the context of the exceptionalism of the old world. America, in other words, is not exceptional. It's very typically Western, typically European in this respect. And the proof of the pudding is go back to the founding of Western civilization from the point of view of its determination of being metaphysical. What does that mean? It means that I have a privileged perspective than those people out there on the margins of the Western world. I have a privileged perspective, and that allows me to see those on the margins according to and to act in relationship to them in such a way that I reform them, in such a way as I impose my privileged, exceptionalist perspective on them. Because I've got the logos. I'm different than they don't. That's exceptionalist, and that's fundamental to the Western ethos. Thus far, I have all too briefly summarized the major critical imperatives of Agamben's radicalization of Heidegger's, Arendt's, and Foucault's destruction of the anthropological phase of the ontotheological tradition. Equally important are the indissolubly related positive possibilities concerning resistance against the biopolitical, democratic, capitalist world order, and beyond that, the coming community. Two things I've been consistently referring to. A mode of resistance that comes out of the critique of biopolitics, modernity, and beyond resistance, an alternative city, an alternative Poland. Following Agamben's retrieval of temporality, the being, I keep insisting, of being, as an ontological phenomenon, particularly Walter Benjamin's time of the now, Jetztzeit, from the oblivion to which the spatializing imperatives of metaphysics are relegated, Agamben, like Arendt, and remarkably like Said, although he never mentioned Said, reads the post-World War II world as an indirect, or more precisely, the liminal point in the development of the logic of nation-state belonging that has precipitated for positive thought the nothing, das nichts, that the modern world will at all costs have nothing to do with all across the continuum of being, from the ontological, subjective, to the more patently socio-political side. The consequence of this liberation of the polyvalent nothing and its now time, precipitated by the eventual self-destruction of the teleological, spatialized time of anthropological modernity and its means ontological, is that potentiality, as such, potentiality as such, has been liberated from its bondage to the act, the higher class. In this new dispensation, the ethical imperative, the human vocation, becomes, in Heidegger's very, very resonant and profound term, the revocation of every vocation. The revocation of every vocation. That's his term. That's the ethical imperative that we introduced earlier on Agamben's perspective. That is, the retrieval of the in-between time of the now renders the sovereign law its promised fulfillment structure, its binary logic of belonging that represents the being of being as nothing, the uncounted, the superfluous, the agreeable, the part of no part, and the operations of the vocational ethic inoperative. A revocation of every vocation equals rendering all of these features of the vocation inoperative. That too is Agamben's term. Inoperacita is the Italian word. This is a version, obviously, of Heidegger, or a radical version of Heidegger's destruction. If you understand destruction in terms of rendering destruction of philosophy, rendering the philosophy inoperative, destruction, not the annihilation of metaphysical thinking, not the annihilation of the identity positive metaphysical thinking, but the rendering of it inoperative, destruction, a interrogation of the structuration of truth by metaphysical thinking as being, the interrogation of structuration for the purpose of releasing, liberating what structure has colonized, the being of being. Destruction, therefore, renders everything remains the same, but it is no longer the force of that sovereign principle is no longer operative, is inoperative. It doesn't work anymore.